June 9, 1945. 6:17 p.m. An internment facility outside Medicine Hat, Alberta. The mess hall doors swung open to impossible abundance. Not the memory of food, not the ghost of better days, but actual plenty. The smell of roasting beef mingling with fresh bread, the steam from vegetables rising into rafters that had never known bombardment, the casual surplus of a nation the war had never touched on its own soil. 47 women stood at the threshold, paralyzed. They'd been told to come for dinner. The word itself felt like a linguistic trap, too generous to be real. In the camps they'd known, in the bunkers and basements of Germany's final collapse, dinner meant watery soup and bread that tasted more of sawdust than wheat. A Canadian corporal stood by the serving line, his uniform clean in a way that seemed almost obscene to women who'd lived in the same clothes for weeks. He spoke in careful German. "Q starts here. Take a tray. Serve yourselves. There's plenty. Plenty." The word landed like something from another language, another reality. One woman, Kathy, a logistics coordinator from Hamburg who'd spent the last year of the war managing supply chains that had nothing left to supply, would write weeks later. "We stood there like animals who'd been beaten with kindness. We could smell food but our minds insisted it must be a trick. They expected starvation rations. They got pot roast. And in that gap between expectation and plate, everything they'd believed about the enemy began to crumble. The moment arrives with the weight of accumulated hunger pressing against disbelief." June 1945. The war in Europe had been over for a month, but Germany was starving with the systematic thoroughness of complete collapse. The final year had been one of cascading disintegration, supply lines severed, agriculture disrupted by combat and conscription, cities reduced to rubble where nothing grew except desperation. By May, the average German civilian ration had fallen below 1,000 calories per day. In urban areas it was often half that. The women who'd been captured in those final weeks, the Nachrichtenhelferinnen and Stabshelferinnen, the signals operators and administrative staff who'd kept Wehrmacht communications and logistics functioning until there was no machinery left to function, had lived on even less. They were auxiliary personnel, low priority for rations. Combat troops ate first. Essential civilians second. Then, if anything remained, the women in uniform who weren't quite soldiers but weren't quite civilians either. When Canadian forces overran their positions in northwestern Germany, these women expected the worst. Propaganda had been explicit, designed to prevent surrender by making capture seem worse than death. So when they were transported across the Atlantic, packed into Liberty ships for a crossing that took 12 days through rolling seas that left half of them seasick and all of them terrified, they braced for punishment disguised as internment. Instead, they found themselves subject to Canadian military regulations that treated them as civilian internees under adapted Geneva Convention standards. The Canadians, it turned out, had rules about prisoners. And the rules said prisoners must be fed. The facility at Medicine Hat had been a military training camp, converted to house German internees pending repatriation. The barracks were solid wood construction, built to withstand prairie winters. The fencing was regulation military standard. The guards were a mix of soldiers rotating through home posting and older personnel deemed essential to domestic service. The convoy arrived at noon on a Saturday. Women climbed down from trucks, clutching bundles that held everything they still owned. They were processed with bureaucratic efficiency. Names, ages, last postings, medical screening. Then assigned to barracks, shown facilities, given basic orientation. Dinner at 6, the camp sergeant had said, Sergeant McLeod from somewhere in Nova Scotia, with an accent that made German sound almost melodic. Mess hall. Don't be late. Now it was 6. They'd come because what choice was there? And they stood frozen by abundance that seemed to violate the laws of physics they'd learned to live by. The mess hall was organized with military precision. Long tables, wooden benches, a serving line where steam rose from containers that gleamed under electric lights that never flickered, never failed, never went dark during bombardment because there was no bombardment here, had never been bombardment, would never be. Kathy picked up a tray, proper metal, substantial, not a repurposed tin can lid or wooden board. She moved down the line in a daze. A server, a Canadian private in kitchen whites, spooned beef onto her plate. Actual beef, a portion the size of her palm, cooked with onions and gravy that looked like it came from actual fat, not chemical approximation. Then mashed potatoes. Then carrots. Then green beans that must have come from somewhere with growing seasons and farms that still functioned. Then bread, wheat bread, real wheat, the kind that required proper flour that hadn't been stretched with sawdust or ground acorns or any of the desperate substitutes that had replaced food in the final year. She stared at her tray. It held more calories than she'd eaten in 3 days. Maybe 4. Miss? The server was looking at her with concern. You all right? This is for one person? He looked confused. Yes, miss. Standard portion. There's tea after. And pudding if you want. Pudding. Dessert. Surplus food consumed for pleasure rather than survival. A concept from another world. She carried her tray to a table where other women sat in stunned silence, examining their plates as archaeologists might examine artifacts from a lost civilization. Around them, Canadian staff moved with the casual efficiency of people for whom this was simply Saturday dinner service. Nothing unusual, just another meal. Kathy cut a piece of beef, raised it to her mouth. The texture shocked her. Actual protein, actual fat, the complex flavors of meat that hadn't been reduced to leather through desperation cooking. She chewed slowly, trying to process not just the food but the fact of it, the casual abundance that said, this is normal. This is what we have. This is what we'll give you. And then she couldn't stop. None of them could. They ate with the mechanical intensity of the truly starved, barely tasting, just consuming, their bodies demanding fuel after running on fumes for so long. I ate until my stomach hurt, Kathy wrote. And then I was ashamed because I had wasted food by eating too quickly to appreciate it. A Canadian guard told me there would be breakfast tomorrow. I thought she was lying. She wasn't. If this moment already changed how you see the war, subscribe, the next will surprise you even more. The policy behind this abundance was not generosity, it was law translated into logistics. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which Canada had signed, specified that prisoners of war must receive rations equal in quantity and quality to those of the depot troops of the detaining power. For Canada in 1945, that meant standard military rations which, despite wartime rationing for certain luxury goods, remained substantial. Canada had not been bombed. Its agricultural infrastructure was intact. Its supply chains functioned. It could afford to feed prisoners properly because it could afford to feed everyone properly. The reasoning was threefold: legal obligation, diplomatic precedent, practical stability. Legal obligation because international treaty compliance was a matter of national credibility. Diplomatic precedent because how you treated enemy prisoners established expectations for how your own prisoners would be treated. Practical stability because hungry prisoners were unstable prisoners, prone to disease, disorder, and management difficulties. But there was something beneath the bureaucratic logic. A directive from Canadian military headquarters, circulated to camp commandants in May 1945, included language that went beyond procedure. These internees will return to Germany. They will remember how they were treated. Let them remember that Canada maintained standards even toward the defeated. It was not mercy. It was strategy. But strategy and mercy, it turned out, could produce identical meals. The days acquired structure with surprising speed. Morning roll call at 7, conducted by Sergeant McLeod with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd been doing this job since 1943 and had learned that consistency was better than harshness. Breakfast in the mess hall. Porridge with milk and brown sugar, toast with butter and jam, coffee that actually tasted like coffee. Work assignments posted on a board. Kitchen duty, laundry, cleaning, clerical work for those with administrative skills. The work was real but not brutal. It maintained the camp's basic operations while giving the internees structure, purpose, something to do besides sit with their thoughts. And the food continued, arriving with the predictable rhythm of a system that had never collapsed. Lunch at noon. Dinner at 6. Portions that didn't shrink, that didn't disappear due to supply problems or punitive withholding. After a week, some of the women stopped finishing everything on their plates. Not because they were full, a hunger that deep takes months to truly fade, but because they were beginning to trust that tomorrow's meals would arrive. That food here was not a weapon but a constant. Margaret had been a telephone operator at a Wehrmacht communications center, routing calls and messages for a district command. 24 years old, efficient, someone who'd survived by being essential. She'd been captured when her post was overrun, found still at her switchboard trying to connect calls for units that no longer existed. At Medicine Hat, she was assigned to the kitchen, helping prepare meals for the camp. She worked alongside Canadian kitchen staff, mostly from the Canadian Women's Army Corps, plus a few older men with medical exemptions. The head cook was Sergeant Bouchard, a French-Canadian from Quebec City who'd run a restaurant before the war and now ran this kitchen with the same professional standards. He treated Margaret not as a prisoner but as a line cook who needed training. "You'll prep vegetables," he said on the first day, his accent making English sound musical. "Properly. Watch." He demonstrated how to peel potatoes without excessive waste, How to cut carrots to consistent size for even cooking. Your turn. Margaret worked. Bouchard corrected. Slower. Consistent. Like this. Again. They worked mostly in silence for several hours. Then Bouchard said, "You've worked in a kitchen before. At home. Before all this. Where's home? Hamburg. Or it was. I don't know what's left." Bouchard nodded, set down his knife. "My cousin was at Dieppe. 1942, he didn't come home." The words sat between them, unavoidable. "I'm sorry," Margaret said quietly. "So am I." Bouchard picked up another carrot. "But people still need feeding. That's the job. Doesn't matter who they are. If they're hungry, you feed them. That's what civilization means." "He did not forgive me," Margaret wrote. "But he taught me his craft. That was more honest than forgiveness. It was the acknowledgement that we were both professionals doing work that mattered beyond politics." Ilse had been a filing clerk at a supply depot, managing inventory records and requisition forms. 28 years old, methodical, a woman who'd believed that competence was virtue enough. She'd spent the war's final months watching the system she helped maintain collapse. Requisitions for supplies that didn't exist, forms for units that had been destroyed, orders that made no sense because the people giving them had lost connection with reality. At Medicine Hat, she was assigned to administrative work, helping process internee records. She worked alongside Corporal Davies, a clerk from Toronto who'd been doing this job since 1944 and had the weary competence of someone who'd processed thousands of lives into categories. One afternoon, Davies set down a form and asked, "Did you believe it? What they told you about us?" Ilse looked up. "Some of it." "Which parts?" "That you would be vengeful. That we'd be punished." Davies was quiet for a moment. "You were punished. Germany was punished. Your cities are rubble. Your people are starving. That's punishment. But you personally?" He gestured around the office. "This isn't punishment. This is just processing. Until someone decides what to do with you. Why not punish us? Because that's not how it works. We have rules. Rules that apply even to people we don't like. Maybe especially to people we don't like. That's what makes them rules instead of suggestions." He separated the nation from the person, Ilse wrote. Germany deserved punishment. I might not. That distinction was new to me. I had assumed collective guilt meant collective punishment. The Canadians made a different assumption. I still don't fully understand it. Hanna was 19, a radio operator who'd spent 8 months in a listening post monitoring Allied transmissions. She'd been good at her job, quick with Morse, sharp with pattern recognition, able to log call signs and frequencies with the precision that made intelligence valuable. She'd been captured when her station was overrun so quickly there'd been no time to destroy the equipment. At Medicine Hat, she struggled with the absence of purpose. She did her assigned work, laundry duty mostly, but moved through it mechanically, her mind still running through radio frequencies that would never broadcast again. One evening she found herself outside the mess hall after dinner service, just sitting on the steps in the long prairie twilight. A Canadian guard, Private Mitchell from Saskatchewan, maybe 24, was on patrol and stopped when he saw her. "You okay?" he asked. She shrugged. Mitchell sat down on the steps, maintaining proper distance. "Homesick? I don't know what I am." "That's fair. War ends and suddenly you're supposed to just be normal again. Like you can just switch it off." "Can you?" "No. But I'm getting better at pretending." He was quiet for a moment. "I worked radio too. Infantry battalion, signals. Spent 2 years listening to traffic, coordinating movements. Now I'm here, guarding people who were probably listening to us while we were listening to them. Does it bother you?" "Sometimes. But you and me, we were just operators. We didn't decide anything. We just passed messages. That has to count for something." "He gave me absolution I hadn't asked for," Hanna wrote. "The idea that being a small part of something large might matter. That following orders might not erase humanity entirely. I don't know if he was right. But I needed to hear it. The transformation happened in small increments that accumulated like interest. A German woman asking for seconds at dinner and receiving them without question, without judgment, without the server's expression changing at all. A Canadian guard teaching a group of internees how to play baseball, the rules explained in fractured German and demonstrated with patience and occasional laughter when someone hit the ball backward. A shared cigarette break where conversation drifted from complaints about work to stories about home to the universal acknowledgement that prairie mosquitoes were terrible regardless of nationality. One evening the camp commandant, Major Walsh, a lawyer from Vancouver who'd been managing internment facilities since 1942, organized what he called a cultural evening in the recreation barracks. The German women were invited to share songs, stories, anything from their culture that didn't involve politics or military content. They sang folk songs. Someone recited Schiller, the poems about nature, about humanity, about ideals that existed before nationalism tried to claim them. A former music teacher from Berlin played harmonica, simple melodies that could have come from anywhere. When they finished, Walsh stood. "Thank you. That was lovely." He paused, choosing words carefully. "You're here because your country lost a war. But you're still people. Your culture exists independent of your government. We can acknowledge both things, that Germany must be held accountable, and that you have value as individuals. Those aren't contradictions. They're requirements for any real peace." He drew lines I hadn't known existed, Kathy wrote. Between nation and person. Between government and culture. Between collective responsibility and individual worth. Those lines mattered. They meant I could acknowledge guilt without disappearing into it. If you're seeing this war in a new light, subscribe. The next scene will challenge you even more. August brought news that shifted the world's axis. Atomic bombs, Japan's surrender, the war's absolute and final end. The camp staff gathered the internees to announce it. The war was over. Completely. Everywhere. The women received the news in silence. Not celebration, they were on the losing side after all. But not quite grief either. Just exhaustion at the sheer weight of years finally ending, replaced by uncertainty about what came next. That evening, Sergeant Bouchard did something unexpected. He announced that dinner would be special, a celebration not of victory but of ending. He'd requisitioned extra supplies, pulled strings, called in favors. The meal that evening was remarkable not for its quantity but for its care. Roast chicken, proper mashed potatoes, fresh vegetables, pie for dessert made with real fruit. It wasn't lavish. It was simply good. Food prepared with attention and served with respect, a statement that said, "This matters. You're leaving soon. Remember this." At one table, Margaret sat across from Sergeant Bouchard. They'd worked together for 2 months but had maintained professional distance, the kitchen workflow mediating their interactions. "This is good," she said, gesturing at her plate. "The chicken. Should be. I've been cooking for 30 years. Will you go back to your restaurant? After?" Bouchard shrugged. "Maybe. If it's still there. If I still remember how to cook for people who aren't soldiers or prisoners. That's the question, isn't it? Whether we can go back to who we were. Can we? No. But maybe we can be something new. Something that remembers both the before and the during. That might be enough." "He gave me permission to be changed," Margaret wrote. "Not to go back but to go forward. That was harder and more honest than pretending the war hadn't happened." September brought repatriation orders. List compiled. Transportation scheduled. The machinery of post-war logistics grinding forward, slowly moving millions back to places that might no longer exist in any recognizable form. The German women would be sent to the British occupation zone, where they would be processed, documented, and released into a country they might not recognize. In the weeks before departure, the Canadians prepared them practically. Gave them information about conditions in Germany, about occupation procedures, about where to find assistance. Provided whatever surplus clothing and supplies could be spared, not much but something. The night before departure, Kathy couldn't sleep. She walked outside, staying in permitted areas, and ended up near the mess hall. The door was unlocked. Inside, tables were set for tomorrow's breakfast. Plates stacked, cutlery arranged, everything ready for a meal that would happen whether she was there to eat it or not. Sergeant McLeod found her there. "Can't sleep?" "No, sir." He leaned against a table. "Scared?" "Yes. You should be. It's going to be hard. Harder than this." "Why am I grateful to leave then?" "Because this isn't life. This is waiting. And eventually waiting has to end." They stood in silence. Then Kathy asked, "Did it matter? What you did here? The food, the rules, the decency. Will we remember?" McLeod thought for a long time. "I don't know. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. Maybe you'll go home and decide we were weak, that kindness is something only winners can afford. Or maybe you'll remember that the enemy fed you when they could have starved you. That they maintained standards when standards seemed pointless. Maybe that'll matter someday. Maybe it won't. But we'll know we tried. That has to be enough." He promised nothing, Kathy wrote. Just honesty. That their decency was its own justification, not dependent on our gratitude or transformation. That integrity meant doing right even without guarantee of outcome. I'm still learning that lesson. The departure came on a gray prairie morning, the sky stretched flat and endless above them. Trucks waited. Women boarded carrying Red Cross parcels, civilian clothes, small bundles of possessions. As they drove through the gates, some looked back at the camp, the barracks, the mess hall, the place where they'd been fed when they'd expected to starve. Sergeant McLeod stood watching. Not waving. Just present, bearing witness the way he'd witnessed their arrival. Acknowledging that these months had happened, that they'd mattered, even if history would mostly forget them. What happened to them after is a mosaic of records, letters, and plausible reconstruction. Kathy returned to Hamburg and found her street erased by bombing. She lived in displaced persons housing for 18 months, worked for Canadian Occupation Administration, and emigrated to Toronto in 1948. She married an engineer, raised 2 daughters, and worked as a bookkeeper until retirement. She kept Sergeant McLeod's name written in the back of an address book, no address beside it, just the name. When her daughters asked about the war, she told them about Medicine Hat, not the fear or the defeat but the meals. They fed us, she would say. They didn't have to. But they did. Margaret went to Munich, found her parents alive in a cellar, and spent 3 years helping them rebuild. She never married. She worked in restaurant kitchens for 40 years, always using the techniques Sergeant Bouchard had taught her. When she died in 2001, her sister found a letter in her effects, addressed to Bouchard but never sent. You showed me that feeding people is holy work regardless of who they are. Thank you for that lesson. It shaped my life. Ilse stayed in the British zone, working for Occupation Administration. She married a British civil servant in 1949 and moved to Edinburgh, where she raised 3 children and worked as a clerk until retirement. In a 1994 oral history interview she said, Medicine Hat taught me that rules could be humane, that law could be kind, that standards mattered even toward enemies. That understanding changed how I saw governance for the rest of my life. Hanna returned to Berlin and found it divided, partitioned, unrecognizable. She worked for American occupation forces, then Radio Free Europe. She never married, never had children, spent her life working in communications because it was what she knew. She died in 2007. Among her effects was a letter to Private Mitchell written in 1985. You told me we were just operators. Just small parts of something larger. You gave me permission to be human despite what I'd been part of. That gift sustained me through decades of trying to understand my own complicity. The story does not end with redemption because redemption implies transaction. Virtue earned through suffering, accounts balanced. These women didn't earn their meals through good behavior or moral transformation. They were simply fed according to standards that applied regardless of who they were or what they'd done. But feeding has consequences. Not immediate, not direct, but real. Every meal that arrived on schedule, every portion that met standard, every moment when food was given without being weaponized, these accumulated into an education about what civilization meant when maintained under pressure. Not abundance. Not luxury. Just adequacy delivered consistently. The choice to uphold standards even when lowering them would have been understandable, even justified. 70 years later, a historian conducting research on Canadian internment camps interviewed a former guard who'd served at Medicine Hat. He was 93, living in a care facility in Calgary, his memory sharp despite his age. Did you resent it? The historian asked. Feeding them so well when your own family was rationing butter and sugar? The man was quiet. Then, sometimes. Yeah, it felt unfair. But Sergeant Bouchard, the head cook, he'd say, we're not feeding them because they deserve it. We're feeding them because we're Canadians and Canadians don't starve prisoners. That mattered to him. His cousin died at Dieppe. He had every right to hate. But he chose standards instead. That's the difference between revenge and justice. Revenge feels good. Justice just is. In another interview conducted in Germany in 2003, a former internee, by then 82, was asked what she remembered most about Medicine Hat. The pot roast, she said. That first dinner. Standing at those doors, smelling meat, thinking there must be some mistake, some trick. And then realizing it wasn't. That this was just dinner. Standard procedure. And that understanding, that our enemies could maintain civilization even toward us, could feed us properly not from weakness but from principle, that broke something in my understanding of the world. I spent 60 years trying to rebuild that understanding on more honest foundations. If this story moved you, if it challenged what you thought you knew, subscribe. History is full of moments like this, hidden in plain sight. Don't miss the next one. The mess hall doors that swung open to impossible abundance echoed through decades. They opened not onto luxury but onto adequacy. Not onto excess but onto standards maintained even under the pressure of victory. The food was not lavish. It was simply proper, portioned according to regulations, served according to schedule, prepared with the competence that said, "This matters. Even you matter enough to feed properly." That message, delivered through pot roast and mashed potatoes and bread that wasn't sawdust, carried more weight than any speech about justice or mercy or the responsibilities of the victor. Because it was not words but actions. Not promises but consistency. Not charity but law, and law, it turned out, could be a kind of mercy when applied without cruelty. The women who stood at that threshold expected starvation. They got dinner. And breakfast. And lunch the next day and every day after, meals arriving with the mechanical predictability of a system that maintained its principles even when abandoning them would have been understandable. That predictability taught them something propaganda hadn't prepared them for. That the enemy could be decent not from weakness but from strength. That maintaining civilization toward the defeated was not failure but choice. That feeding prisoners properly was not generosity but simply what civilized nations did, even to those who'd stopped being civilized themselves. It was not redemption. But it was education. A lesson delivered through properly portioned rations that said, "This is what we are. This is what we maintain. This is what survives even when everything else fails." The war had taught them to expect vengeance disguised as justice. The captivity, strange and uncomfortable and shot through with all the complications of being held by those they'd called enemies, taught them something harder. That decency was possible even in defeat. That standards could transcend victory and loss. That dinner, served on time and portioned properly, could be a statement of principle more powerful than any proclamation about values or civilization or the responsibilities of power. They called it dinner. The Canadians called it regulations. History might call it civilization maintained through the grinding machinery of daily routine. But for women who'd been starving, who'd expected punishment, who'd been told their enemies were savages, that pot roast was a lesson in what humanity looked like when it chose to be human even when it didn't have to be. They expected deprivation. They got dinner. And in that gap between fear and food, the future became imaginable again.